Good morning. I'm talking very quietly because it's just after 2 a.m. in my house, and the rest of my family is all asleep. I should be asleep right now. My alarm doesn't go off until 2:35, but I woke up at 12:35 this morning and have been unable to get back to sleep. So this is what I'm doing right now. Jigsaw puzzle. 2 o'clock. I have to start getting ready for work in about 30 minutes, 40 minutes. But I couldn't turn off my brain. So here we are. I'm not a puzzle guy per se. Kind of picked it up during the quarantine with my family and have really started to like it. It's not even my puzzle, it's borrowed. I tried prayer this morning first to go back to sleep. That's what I always try first. And it didn't work. And it got me thinking a lot about all the things that hadn't worked this summer and this year. What you're about to watch is the first episode of a new series we're starting. It's about faith and religion and spirituality. We don't talk about that a lot. I don't know why it's a big deal for a lot of us. I got up at 12:30 and needed to go back to sleep, and the first thing I tried was prayer. I can't be the only one. But I don't know what this is going to look like. I don't know what it's going to sound like. During some of these interviews, the person I'm interviewing has asked me to send them questions, and I've said I'm not really writing any down. I'm kind of winging it. Been a lot of that this summer too. I hope you get something out of these interviews, but I hope I get something out of these interviews. I have so far, to the ones we've already recorded. Please leave your comments. You can reach out to me on social media. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. Email. You can comment here. But I hope you enjoy these. And I hope your prayer life, if you have one, is good. And I hope you're getting some sleep. One of us needs to. Today, I am very glad to be joined by a man that I'm just now seeing over Zoom for the first time. This is the first time he and I have seen each other, quote unquote, face to face. We've only talked over the phone before now. But just over a couple of conversations, I was really glad to talk to him, to hear his experience. And I knew pretty quickly that I wanted to have him on early on in this project. And that's Rabbi Mark Levin from Congregation Beth Torah in Johnson County. Mark, thank you so much for taking some time out of your schedule and hanging out with me for a little bit today.
Pleasure to be able to do that. Thanks for the invitation.
So in 90 words or less, just tell our listeners a little bit about your faith background here in Kansas City and especially as a rabbi, because I know you've been at Beth Torah since it was founded in 1988. Is that right?
That's correct. I'm the founding rabbi of Congregation Beth Torah. I've been a rabbi in Kansas City since 1976. So 44 years. I was ordained at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati and came here directly from there. And along the way, earned a doctoral degree in liturgy. Just been at a congregational rabbinate, and now I'm retired for the last 6 years and Happy to be able to serve in various capacities.
We're going to try and talk about a lot over the course of these conversations. You're just the first of what I hope are several people that will join me for some of these conversations. We're going to talk about COVID-19 and racism and all the different things that are politics, all the kinds of different things that we are, for lack of a better term, consumed with right now. But I wanted to start with you because I want to kind of lay a foundation of almost a starting point, so to speak, of where we are as a faith community as we enter some of these conversations. Obviously, you've been involved in the faith community for a long time, just here in Kansas City. You've spent your entire professional career in that vein. So where would you say faith, that word, is right now for us in Kansas City? What is faith? Where are we as a faith community in Kansas City? What do we look like right now?
Well, I wish it'd be more coalesced. I wish that it would be easier to define because, look, I've been here for 44 years, and the year before I came, there was an intra-city local clergy association that only worked for a little while. I think it was called MICO, something like that. But we haven't had that. So there's really a variety of responses in the faith community. Sometimes folks will talk about the African-American community as being a faith community, but I don't think that's even the case. The Jewish community, which is small, and of course I've been part of that for more than 4 decades, is really not a coalesced community. So you see various different faith responses, but religion in general responds to the question of life and death. And of course, COVID is a life and death issue. And so the response to COVID is going to be, in some sense, a religious response. It may be an institutional religious response, it may be a private, personal religious response, but it is by definition a religious response, both because it threatens our lives and the lives of the people we love, and because it's attacking the entirety of the community simultaneously. And fundamentally, religion is a communal activity, or there's such a thing as a communal belief system. So in the United States, we have the civic religion, the civil religion of the United States, which for instance, will say, whether it's true or not, we say that we all react as Americans, that we all have a common history and a common destiny. Whether that's true or not in terms of the way we act is another thing, but that's part of the religious faith of Kansas City and the greater the United States.
I will rarely boil down things to math problems because I'm a words person. I am not a numbers person. But if we were to boil this down to a math situation, let's say when you began your professional career 40 plus years ago, out of every 10 people, X identified as a person of faith. Compare that to when you started, and what would you say it is now, both here in Kansas City, or you can go larger than that, but just how people identify themselves. How has that changed in the last 4 decades?
Well, part of the problem with that is that in the time that I've been active in being a rabbi, or in the clergy in general, that definition has changed. So for instance, for the last 50 years or so, you'll see people define themselves as spiritual and other people define themselves as religious. So you have the folks who belong to institutional religious organizations, a particular church, a particular synagogue, a particular mosque, etc. And those folks definitely will define themselves somewhere within the religious sphere because they go someplace. And that's the normal definition. I think that's dropped over the years. There was a time in the 60s, 70s, 80s, I think many more people did, in fact, associate mentally with some sort of institution. But in terms of a values approach to living, which is essentially what religion is about. So you have lots and lots of small groupings today where people really really do have some sort of a faith, whether they identify it as that or not, but they have a belief system. So like I run into a lot of people say, well, I'm not religious, but I am very spiritual. Well, that's a belief system. It says something about ritual. It says something about their history in an organized, quote, an organized religion. But it's definitely some sort of an association with that which is godlike, or that which is eternal, or that which has values. So I don't know that that's really dropped. I think formal affiliation with religion, certainly in the liberal religious, I'm a Reform rabbi, and certainly affiliation in the Jewish community has dropped, and I hear the same thing from my Protestant colleagues. Evangelical church was up for a long time. They're clearly not liberal, but I hear that their numbers are dropping as well. But I really don't think that we rely less on belief systems. It's just that they're not as clearly defined as they once were, and perhaps not even historic institutions.
Is that because we are a more individualized people than we maybe ever have been? Is that just because I have my own boxes that I like to check about myself? I have my whole world here on my phone. I can have an entire day's worth of conversations. I'm interviewing you over Zoom. I mean, I can have an entire day's worth of interactions without leaving my room if I so choose. Do those go hand in hand because we're a more individualized society now, that I can be more quote unquote spiritual without having to be the grouped religious section?
I do think that the American devotion, or some would say obsession with individualism, is a factor here. You could call this individualism, but I'm going to define it just a little bit differently now. And that is that at one time, 50 years ago, when I was in seminary, people felt that they needed to belong to a religious organization. Even whether or not they attended, many people would simply have some sort of an affiliation. One person expressed it to me in terms of Kansas City as, you don't dare die without the name of a church or synagogue next to your name. Whether you attended or not, different thing. Whether you believed or not, really a different thing. But there was a sense that you needed to affiliate. In my own children, for instance, who are in their 20s and 30s, I don't see that. I don't see the necessity of affiliating with an historic faith or a historic religion. But again, that doesn't mean that people don't have some sort of a faith commitment in their personal life. So it's harder to track, for one. And those folks are not easily finding groupings that they can say, if you feel, well, God forbid, some sort of a terrible thing occurs, and you feel like you need a community of people who believe the way you do to help support you. If you're not affiliated, or you don't have some sort of a friendship system, it's very hard to find that on the fly at the last minute.
What's the bar between the spiritual person who will tell you, absolutely, I'm a spiritual person, even someone that will go so far as to say, I believe in God, or I believe in a higher being, what have you? What's the bar between I'm a spiritual person and I go to fill in the blank church?
Okay. So this is technical, and I just want to say for those people who are listening, I have quite a number of degrees in religion. And among them is an undergraduate degree in phenomenology of religion from Boston University 100 years ago, I like to tell people.
All those books behind you are there for a reason, we'll say.
They're there for a reason. So phenomenologically, religions consist of myth systems, which today we call narrative, symbol systems, and ritual systems. And the human beings, as human beings, we have those. And in my discussions with people who call themselves spiritual, what they say they don't have, whether they do or they don't, is another question. You need an anthropologist to decide. But they say that they have left behind the formal ritual system of an organized religion. That doesn't mean they don't have a ritual system. They may have a ritual system of their own devising and not be aware of it. And a religious ritual system points at something higher. So, for instance, I know people who light candles, right? They, so to speak, they light candles religiously in both sense of the terms. Okay, they light them regularly, and they light them to connect them with something that they identify as being higher. So, folks who, you'll probably have people who object to this. Folks who call themselves spiritual are simply limiting themselves to a part of a greater definition of the religious perspective by omitting some traditional symbols. They say that they're eliminating traditional symbols, their traditional rituals. That doesn't mean that they're devoid of symbols and rituals. Human beings are never devoid of symbols and rituals. And maybe their myth system, what they believe in terms of myths. By myth, I don't mean lies. By myth, I mean the fundamental system of stories that we tell each other to explain reality.
Right. It sounds like you're describing just a difference in comfort level for a lot of people. I am comfortable with this level of spirituality, whether it be lighting a candle or whatever, or I'm more comfortable with and have more of a desire. Is that a fair way to describe it? Just a different level of what makes people comfortable or uncomfortable?
It is comfort, but I would just describe it then again, differently. This would be sort of an anthropological perspective, that they will say that those symbols, those rituals, which I identify with an historic religious organization, a church, a synagogue, a mosque,
Right.
those traditional forms, I don't identify with. What they really mean is that those are not live symbols, rituals, myths to them. So you see people enact basically dead rituals, symbols all the time in organized life. In other words, they're participating in something. They say, this really has no meaning to me, but I do it because it's expected of me. Well, that's a dead myth. That's a dead symbol. That's a dead ritual. Okay? But then what they don't realize is that they have a myth, symbol, and ritual system that they are participating in that may not be from an organized religious grouping, but they may share it with their neighbors. They may share it with their friends. And everybody in their association group goes, oh yeah, that I do that too. Well, that's a live symbol. That's a live ritual for them.
Yeah. I talked a little bit about my faith background. I was raised in the church. I went to a Church of Christ all my life as a child. I still attend a Church of Christ here in this area. And the only reason I won't identify them is just so people don't come track me down necessarily. But I'm comfortable with a faith response to things is the point of what I'm saying here. With COVID in the last 6 months of all of us being unified under a certain level of rules, boundaries, what have you, can you compare anything in your life to that kind of, we are all up against this period? Yes, we'll talk about it in terms of faith, but just in terms of economics, challenges, that kind of thing, that we're all in the same boat because of this thing. Can you compare COVID to anything?
Yeah, and I do want to say something about what you said about your own religious background. I really welcome that, because it says to me, like many Americans, you're comfortable with the language of religion. And there are places where people are just not, and
Right.
they define themselves differently. So America is a religious place in the regard, in respect that you described it. Okay. Now, in terms of COVID, look, COVID is a universal enemy in the United States. One is it has put us all up against the human worst fear, which is the fear of our own demise, the fear of death, okay? The fear of the end for us. And psychologists will say, some psychologists will say, there's major literature on this, that this is the human worst fear. Well, generally we handle that risk because, like you get into a car, you could possibly die, but you've handled all the risks 1,000 times, and you don't know. You don't think it's going to happen. You basically have come to grips with it. Okay, here's a lion that just appeared in your backyard, and you go, how did a lion appear in my backyard? Oh my God, I'm living in Missouri. There's no lions. If I walk outside, I could be dead. And you don't know how to cope with that. Well, the whole populace is dealing with that, except for the people who are denying it. Okay? And in a sense, they're dealing with it as well. So have we seen a common enemy? Okay, now, I believe we have. I mean, I go back to the Vietnam War when I was in college and the protest movements that were alive there. And we had a lot of protest movements at that time, whether you were on, regardless of which side you were on. But people felt that there was this conflict out there that they had to confront. So whether it was Vietnam, whether it was women's rights, whether it was civil rights, the whole nation was involved in the sense of being up against something, a common theme which divided us and united us in the sense that everybody took a side. Yeah. And we really do have that sense of confrontation now. I wish that we were more unified around a general principle, and that general principle would be a religious principle. We're all responsible for one another, and life matters. Life really does matter. Okay? And I can't do something that's going to threaten your life, even if it makes me comfortable. And even though I'm totally comfortable not wearing a mask, for instance, because I live in suburbia and there's plenty of space between people and I can choose where I go and I'm retired and I don't have to go to work. Even though that's the case, and it's not as big a problem for me, I have a civic responsibility. Now, that's a religious response. You can identify with love your neighbor as yourselves, Leviticus 19:18. You can identify it as we are all created in the divine image, which is Genesis in a number of different places, like 5:1. See, I can quote Bible too.
Absolutely.
You know, nonetheless, it is a religious response, and the most fundamental religious response. So yes, we are confronting a universal religious problem here. And in terms of has it occurred before, yes, I would go back to the 60s and 70s, but perhaps I'm forgetting something along the way.
I want to ask you about congregations and churches over the last few months that have had to adapt a lot. Many of them, if not all of them, have gone to virtual congregations, virtual worship services. A lot of them doing the drive-up situation. In the early days of COVID, there was different situations. We had at least one local congregation that sued for the right to have people to come in and be there. How would you describe, classify the response that those religious organizations, the churches, the congregations, the mosques have had to make to these rules when it comes to we can't let people come in anymore? How would you describe that response?
The ultimate religious principle for Jews, and now I speak as a rabbi, is to save a life. The book of Deuteronomy says, therefore choose life that you and your descendants may live. This is a matter of life and death. And as I just said, one needs to choose not only life for oneself, but life for those. I recognize in you something that I may suffer. There's a philosopher named Hermann Cohen, alive 100 years ago, who said that's the beginning of ethics. When I recognize my situation in you, that's the beginning of ethics. That's love your neighbor as yourself. And I think we do absolutely have a religious response to one another. If people in a church were putting their own lives at risk and could choose to do that, okay, and isolated to themselves, it would be a different religious problem. The problem then would be, am I willing to take the risk? Am I willing to get into a car? That's my decision. But you are putting other people's lives at risk, and then you have a civic and communal responsibility, and that's on a whole different level. So how has this affected the religious community? Yes, I think that people not coming together to worship affects religious community, and the religious system in this country is dependent upon community. It's dependent upon the community for loyalty, for mutual support. I mean, there's lots of literature, for instance, that say if you're in a religious community, you're likely to live longer. Well, that's not because God comes down and visits you with blessings. That's because living in a community, okay, you live longer. That's a human fact. And there's plenty of literature that establishes that. Well, that's been disrupted. How do we support one another through a religious community and when we can't even get together? Well, there are churches that are providing food for one another. They're putting food in the back of people's trunks, etc. Okay, so there is a religious response to this that is pretty widespread, but it's not universal, and it's affecting a lot of different people where they cannot come together for their traditional time to worship together and experience that sense of community and mutual support, and to be able to discuss, we're all in this together, aren't we? There's a sense of separation, alienation, which is contrary to religious spirit, but how are you going to get around it? I'll give you one example. I walk every morning, and maybe I shouldn't say that on public television, but I do. I'm friendly with everybody on my walk. I mean, it's incredible that people are now responding. I could tell you people's whole life stories from some of the people who are on my walk. I know nothing about them except for what I've learned on my morning walk. I can tell you where they work. I can tell you whether they've gone back to work. I can tell you about their children. I can tell you about their struggles with college and whether their children are going to go back to school, what the professions are. And it's all from people getting out simultaneously and wanting to visit with one another.
We don't know what this is going to look like whenever I use the phrase COVID is over, but who knows what that's going to be, when it's going to be, what over looks like, any of that, whether it's when we get a vaccine, that kind of thing. But we don't know. That includes with churches. When churches are told you can go back to doing business, for lack of a better word, but you can go back to operating the way that you were operating beforehand. You can welcome your entire congregations back. What would you see as the most important thing that congregations of any faith could and should do when that day happens? And what would be the biggest mistake they could make whenever that day happens?
Oh man, that's good. Why don't you just say, we'd like to get you in trouble, so please.
Listen, if people have hung around this long through this, it's now time to tick them off. It's, you know.
I would like to see every religious institution open simultaneously and say, you come. If you choose to go someplace else, go someplace else. That's fine. But we want to see a period of time, a month, whatever, where everyone goes. Everyone, I don't know what the greeting is going to be at that time with one another, but everyone greets. Everyone is open. Everyone is saying, thank God, or whatever your expression is, we got through this together as a community. Okay? Regardless of what your stand was, if the threat is behind us, the threat is behind us as a nation. I had an article actually in the Star where I was really hoping that as much as this attacked all of us simultaneously and mutually, that the solution would be simultaneous and mutual. And of course, it did not happen. Okay, people turned against one another, etc. Well, maybe when it's past, we can turn to a mutuality that says, you know, we're all in this together. We're all human beings. We're all Americans. And by God, we're going to celebrate our deliverance from this plague as a community and then ask, how do we build together? I don't care where you go. I don't care where you go. It could be your faith community. It could be the place down the street. All your neighbors are going. You pick yourself up and you go too. Okay? Everybody goes and celebrates life together. What's the mistake they could make? I don't really know. I suppose trying to be separate about it, or a theology that would exclude others. This is a worldwide, oh, by the way, my grandmother, my father's mother, died in 1919 of the pandemic.
I was going to say during the flu pandemic.
Yeah, she's been dead 101 years.
Wow.
Yeah. She died right after my dad was born. Why do I make that point? My father grew up without a mother. That affected him and me and my kids, and probably for generations to come. But I can tell you how it affected me and I think my children. So this is not a small deal. Anybody who thinks this is 160,000 Americans is blind.
Yeah.
This is
everybody. They're ripping in the water. Yeah.
This is everybody. And it needs to be acknowledged. And that's a religious question. I don't care what religion you're in. That is the major religious question probably of the year. And it ought to be acknowledged when it comes by. And probably, hadn't thought about it, but probably not acknowledging that is the error that people can make, and somehow making it into a sectarian issue. Whatever your theology is, whatever you think, you think God sent us a plague because of our sins. I don't know. That's not my theology. Nonetheless, we've suffered this together. We need to acknowledge and celebrate its end together.
My co-anchor in the mornings, Lindsay Scheibele, and I were talking about this morning actually about the professional changes that could come from this. Like, what if we have 4-day work weeks now? What if we have more people working from home? And wouldn't it be great if we come out of this and said, you know what, home life is maybe more important than we were giving credit for it to be. Maybe you don't have to have that thing in at 5 o'clock every day. Maybe we can have a little bit of wiggle room here. From a faith standpoint, I was struck by what you said about the conversations you're having on your walk. Is that the possible silver lining out of this whole thing, that we might just see people more than we did before, whether creed or color or whatever. I mean, I don't mean to be lofty
Lord, I
and
hope so.
empty, but
And I want to say something about that. I'm obviously a very gregarious person. I could talk to a tree. It's just the way I've pretty much always been. But I've been very surprised at the responsiveness of people that I simply meet along the way. They may give off the sense when you look at them, oh, well, that person's not going to respond. I'm telling you, 98% of the people I come across respond, and happily. Okay, I mean, they're not wearing masks because we're socially distanced because we're walking. Okay,
right.
They smile, they wave. I have people wave at me from the porch. They start conversations, they respond to conversations. They'll tell you not intimate personal things, but about children. Yes, I think there's a aloneness, this individuality that I consider to be a plague in the United States. It wasn't always this way, Daniel Boone, and all that jazz. But individuality has gotten to be a plague. It separates, it makes us compete against one another. We need much more mutuality nationally, internationally, but also as Americans. So yes, that may be a silver lining. And I got to tell you, I think part of this is generational. I talk to my own kids, and they're not as driven. My children are not as driven occupationally as we were, my generation was, it seems to me. They are more oriented towards family and family time already. And I think that's a good change in values. Perhaps this plague will further that, and I think that would be a very good thing. People do now acknowledge they need others, and we've become very aware of that. And I don't care how big the gap is between you and me, coronavirus has proven our similarities are much greater than the things that we imagine divide us.
Last thing I want to ask you, Mark, is you and I obviously come from different faith backgrounds, but I am always interested in being around people who have been a part of something that I am also interested in for longer than I've been in part of it. And this is not an old joke, but you've been doing it longer than I've been doing it.
Yeah, I always wonder how that happened. How did I get so old? I'm not sure.
Both life and faith you've been doing longer than I've been doing it. What do you pray right now about COVID? Whenever you pray, what are your prayers? What do they sound like? What is your even loftiest prayer about COVID? Is it something we've already talked about or something we haven't touched on? What do you pray?
I do not believe in an interventionist God. I am absolutely a believer. I am absolutely a believer in afterlife. But I do not believe in an interventionist God. I believe that God set up the world as God intended it to be. It doesn't need to intervene. So I don't believe in supernatural miracles. There are things that I would call miracles. So what I would pray is that we wake up to the godlike in each of us. And when Genesis chapter 1 says that we're created in the divine image, I mean, the Hebrew is, well, let us make man in our image according to our likeness.
Right.
And we take that really seriously. Really seriously. And that the divine is sitting next to us. And whether my prayer is that whether I succumb to this or I survive it, that I recognize the divine in the world and that I be a vehicle of that divinity to the people around me, such that however long life lasts, they would be able to bring God in the world through their reaction to the other, because I think that's God's intention. A side of this is to see our mutual humanity If you want to look for a divine message here, this has shown us that all human beings are subject to the same fears, threats, and triumphs. Why can we not see that in our daily actions? God, let us see it. We have a prayer recited several times a day. It's part of another prayer. The God who makes peace in the highest heavens, make peace among us here on earth. See, there's a realm of peace that we can imagine. And somehow we manage to see our differences more than we see our similarities. And if COVID hasn't brought that message home of our mutual suffering, I don't know what could possibly do it.
Well, Mark, as I expected, you've set a pretty high bar for anybody else that comes on and talks to me. I know, and I know that anybody that's listening or watching this knows that we could talk about this with you for a long time and have lots of different conversations. And hopefully, if you're willing, maybe on later on, if this continues for as long as we hope it will, maybe we can have you on again to talk about another topic that's a little bit more specific and not quite so broad. But I really appreciate you coming on and helping me kind of have a baseline from where to have these conversations. I really appreciate your time.
It's an enormous pleasure. Thank you for asking me. And among the benefits of having been around for a long time is every so often somebody will ask you what you think. Whether they do anything about it or not, hey, that's another matter. But you've been around a while. What do you think? Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.